Welcome to the Up Close Podcast, your home for conversations about the present and future of public education. We have a very special guest with us today, someone for whom I have great admiration and respect, Albert Sykes, who I'll introduce you to a bit further in just a moment. With Albert, we're going to explore some very important issues on this podcast, from community organizing to issues and opportunities in public education in the Deep South and especially in Mississippi. For Albert, advocating for civil rights in Mississippi and across America has been a lifelong pursuit. He grew up one street away from the home where civil rights leader Medgar Evers lived and died in Jackson. Growing up, Albert drew inspiration from Evers and began organizing and standing up for youth issues, including public education. He became a student of the famed Algebra Project and civil rights hero Bob Moses, who was honored by the NEA Foundation 2 years ago for outstanding contributions to public education. And in Mississippi, Albert went on to lead the growth and development of a statewide cadre of math literacy workers and young political organizers. His NPR StoryCorps conversation with his son, Aiden, about attending protests and growing up Black in Mississippi was ranked the #1 podcast in the nation when presented by NPR in 2015. Albert has completed a policy and social justice residency at Brown University, and he led the organizing efforts of the National Youth Congress for the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer in Jackson. He's been active in the development of the independent television services Masculinity Project, sponsored by the Ford Foundation. He's helped organize events with organizations such as Gathering for Justice with Harry Belafonte and Take Back America. He developed the classroom curriculum for Barack and Curtis, a film from acclaimed director Byron Hurt, and he was the director of policy and advocacy for the Young People's Project in Mississippi. I know that's a lot, but I wanted you to know the full background of this very talented young man. Albert today is the executive director of the Institute for Democratic Education in America in Jackson, Mississippi. And in this capacity, he advocates for policies that enable all students to access quality education as a constitutional right. And he has helped with efforts against the state takeover of Jackson public schools. I've gotten to know Albert over these past 3 years as he is one of the leaders of the foundation's investment in community schools development in Jackson, Mississippi. And I hope he'll talk a little bit about that experience during this podcast. But before I turn to Albert, I just want to share one more thing about him. He has won so many awards. Time does not permit for me to enumerate those, but I will lift up that he is the recipient of the Fannie Lou Hamer Social Justice Award from the veterans of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, which was a tremendous honor. And he is the father of 4 boys. Albert, welcome to Up Close. It's a pleasure to have you with us for this conversation today.
Thank you for letting me be here. It's an honor to spend time with you. Definitely want to start off not only thanking you for letting me be here with you today, but just for the mentorship and the leadership that you've shown in front of me and the investments that you not only made in Mississippi, but that you made in me personally. And I appreciate that. And I thank you for being a living example of what I know true leadership to look like, feel like, and be.
Well, you are very, very kind, Albert. I appreciate that. But this is all about you. So let's just start at the beginning. You grew up in the Shady Oaks community, as I referred to just earlier, which is, for those of y'all who are not familiar with Mississippi, that's an historic region of Jackson, Mississippi. And that's where, Albert, you had your first introduction to advocacy and activism. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I came home from school as a kindergarten student, and I was so excited because I got to color this picture of Dr. King and a picture of Rosa Parks with our crayons. And they told us about the work that they had done and that they were Black people. And I was so excited, like these heroes. This was the first time I had ever heard like stories of Black resistance or Black impact at a national level. So I come home and I'm telling my grandmother about this. And my grandmother took me to Medgar Evers' house and she told me that the same way that I revered the stories of Dr. King and Rosa Parks, there's somebody lived in my community who contributed to the country in the same way. And that he lost his life contributing to the country in the same way. And so from her, what I did learn was the difference between sacrifice and thievery. Was we give these stories of Medgar Evers and Dr. King and other folks as stories of people who gave their life, like people dedicated their life to a cause, but their life was stolen from them because of their dedication to that cause. And so I learned that from my grandmother. And when I met Bob Moses, I was 11 years old. And when he said Medgar Evers' name, that's what made me have any kind of attraction to want to have a relationship with Bob, was because he was a person who actually knew Medgar Evers and had worked with him. And so for me, that gave him the stamp of approval and made him legit to me as an 11-year-old child.
My goodness. How did you go on from meeting Bob Moses, getting deeply involved in the Algebra Project, and then determining ultimately that advocacy and activism is what you would dedicate your life to?
Oh, it was because of Bob. And because in knowing Bob, you know so many other people. One of the things that Bob was steadfast and honest about who contributed to the movement and who were the people who were the backbone and the drivers of the movement. So through Bob, I met Hollis Watkins. Through Bob, I met folks like Nashambe Lambright, who is running One Voice in Mississippi now. Mm-hmm. Not much older than me, but still the person who helped raise me and mentor me. Dory and Joyce Latner, the Latner sisters, who done a lot of work in Mississippi, who were just featured in the movie that they made about Bayard Rustin, and just their contributions to the movement work in Mississippi, but also to the movement work across the country. Meeting Mr. Belafonte as a child. All these things were because Bob was so determined that people understood that anything that you respected him for or lifted him up for bloomed and blossomed from what other people invested in him, starting with Ella Baker. And with me never meeting Ella Baker in person in my life, with Ella Baker being dead when I was a child, the example and the blueprint that she set forth and that she put inside of Bob is the thing that still guides me and a lot of other young people who interacted with him today.
Mm. Was there some pivotal moment, even with all of those tremendous influences by the giants of the civil rights movement? You know, even so, you at one point had an epiphany. You made a personal decision. This is what I also am going to dedicate my life to. Was it just that it was generative over all of those times, all that time? Or was there some kind of epiphany, some moment when you decided this is what I have to do with my life too?
Right, absolutely. It was when I began to meet these people. When I started absorbing those stories, I started to understand, like, these not just stories, these are the places of accountability of what do I owe back to the things that's been paid forward in front of me. And when I'm hearing it firsthand from the people who paid it forward, I started to understand what I had to do and what I needed to do. But then also at a certain point, when I started to understand the state of Mississippi, and when I started to understand the United States of America and my place in it as a Black child, And then eventually as a Black man, I began to understand that my work wasn't just about improving my day-to-day conditions. It had to be generational. That I had a hope that I would raise kids who wouldn't come up in the world with a fraction of the racism that I started to understand as a child. But I'm also at a place where now I'm raising my kids to understand the generational work that they have to do. And I hope that myself and the folks in my generation are setting forth the same blueprint for them that Bob and other folks set forth for me. So the epiphany was looking at my skin and understanding that it was different. And honestly, before I knew anything about the civil rights movement, I knew that I was Black because in Mississippi, at the time that I was a child in the mid 80s, you go to Chuck E. Cheese and you would see mixed families. You would see not Black and white people married to each other, but you would see Black children and white children in the same establishment. But it would absolutely be clear when a Black mother had to protect you because a white mother didn't want you to play with their child. Like in this public place where we all paid to get in, like a white mother would make it apparent to you that you were off limits for that child. And sometimes the child would even say, well, why I can't play with him? That's my friend. Like you don't really know each other, but as kids, you don't have this innate hate for each other. And then I saw it as a child where adults in different spaces would make clear that because of the color of your skin, you didn't have the access or you didn't have the rights and the freedoms that other children who didn't look like you would have. And education was the arena that became the most apparent to me, where you felt like you had a good education because you went to a safe school, which meant nothing happened to you. You ate, you didn't get harmed, you went home. Around the time of 17, 18, we started having this discussion about the right to education, and it became clear to us that we never had a quality education and that we were never in a system that had an intention of giving us a quality education. And so we traced it back to what we call a sharecropper's education, which was that we were kids who were growing up in the information age, who were still being trained and educated to only have the skills of what was necessary to go out and be a sharecropper or laborer, whether it was low-wage labor or free labor. Low-wage labor in the sense of working at different factories and things that's put up and that you can only move based on your education attainment, or free labor in the sense of laws that make it easier to fill our prison systems with people, and that the lack of education is one of the excuses that we use to dehumanize people and say that they don't deserve rehabilitation. They deserve to be incarcerated.
You have said so much in that single response to my question, Albert, and I want to unpack it a little bit. I'd just like to start. You've alluded to how much things have changed in the South over the past 30, 40 years, perhaps more than some people in other parts of the country realize, the tremendous change that has occurred there, and yet how persistently some of the same issues of racism, prejudice, exclusion, dehumanization, and so forth continue. When you step back and you look at the whole of it, how would you characterize what you see as this moment in the struggle for justice, equity, opportunity in the South? Just generally, and then we'll go into education specifically.
I think the moment for opportunity is really rooted in community education and community organizing that allows us to understand what systemic racism looks like. One of the hardest things to talk about in the South is racism, not just because of the presence of our white cohabitants. It's also the fact that when you grow up in a majority black city with a majority black police force and a person gets killed by a black officer, then that was just a police that killed a person. We don't see the racism in it because the color is the same. We hadn't got to this place of really understanding how systems are impacting places like Jackson. So systemic racism says you shouldn't have clean water in a place like Jackson. Systemic racism says that when your kids get out for Christmas break, you should probably prepare for them to be at home for another 2 weeks because infrastructure is going to dictate that the water pipes, when they thaw out, are going to have main breaks all over the city, and you have a whole city without water, running fresh, clean water for at least 2 weeks at a time, right? Systemic racism says that in the Mississippi Delta, it's more affordable to shut down hospitals and let people die than to invest in healthcare and keep people healthy and alive. If you look at the healthcare crisis in the Mississippi Delta, that's man-made, it's constructed, it's intentional, and it's definitely intended for a certain class of people. And so this moment and the biggest opportunity that we have in this moment is really to do the internal work of understanding how systems work for us and also understanding how systems are actively working against us. And how do we use these systems to our benefit that have always served to cause much detriment to us?
Can you talk about that a little bit more as pertains to what happens in the educational systems in Mississippi?
Yeah, so in education, you have a state government that says Nissan is worth $10 billion in tax breaks per year. And that the way we subsidize that tax break, if you go look at the bottom line for cuts in education, it's been about $10 billion per year. So at the same time that Nissan in a 10-year span gets $100 billion in tax breaks at $10 billion a year, education loses $100 billion in investment at the same $10 billion a year. And the same factory and factories like it are the ones that ingest the people that come from this education system that intentionally says we're going to not educate you. So I always talk about Bob Moses being on the stand in the Mississippi Delta courtroom when the judge asked him, why do you continue to attempt to register illiterates to vote? And Bob said to the judge that the state of Mississippi could not have it both ways, that you could not intentionally cause illiteracy amongst people and then use that illiteracy as the mechanism and the measure to say how they can participate politically. And I say that today we still challenging Mississippi to answer that question when it comes to economics and education and when it comes to full societal participation. How can you intentionally under-resource and under-educate people? How can you intentionally allow for crumbling infrastructure in majority black cities across this state and then use all of those things as the reasons why people don't deserve and are not worthy of accessing the best of what this state should be able to offer? I mean, if you go back and look at the Mississippi State Constitution prior to 1890, it was one of the strongest state constitutions in the history of this country because it guaranteed many, 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 many rights that people only thought would always exist for only white people. Mississippi went and stripped this constitution and stripped a lot of rights for many of its citizens because it was not equipped to absorb this thing That's called free Black bodies.
Mm-hmm. Albert, there are so many different needs and ways to make change and need to make change. Such a great need to make change. Where have you prioritized your efforts as you work now in education systems change in Mississippi?
Well, where I prioritize it first is in the story of the communities who wake up and live this every day. The educators who show up and teach our children, regardless of condition, regardless of resource. To the parents who wake up and have to be parents every day. To the students who have to wake up and be students every day. But what it is an issue of not only providing spaces where we hear the issues, but also being intentional about building spaces where we introduce opportunities for solutions, which is one of the ways that I know you is because of the community schools effort, which is this space where not only can you hear what people say they need, but you have a mechanism that's been proven and that also has a blueprint for how you resource and build the partnerships that's necessary to answer people's day-to-day needs. And it respects the fact that even in one city, across 3 different schools, you might have 3 different sets of needs. And that this model is about equity and answering needs as they are presented versus saying this is the way that you have to do this for everybody everywhere. So here you see in Jackson this excitement around, oh, you mean I could really say something about what I want to have happen in my child's school? Yeah. Oh, you mean that they got to let me meet with my child's counselor? You have students that say, so I'm able to have input on what my medical needs are or what my different freedoms should be, what I want for my after school supports. You have principals that's understanding that, hey, I have something at my disposal that's not a project. It's not another thing to do. It's something that gives me a way to be a principal. It's a parent that says, I have these wraparound services that not only serve my child, but my whole family is thriving because somebody listened. And I feel more invested in showing up as a parent because now I have the time and now I have the trust and now I have the system that says come and be, not listen and do, but come and be. And so this is one of the most powerful tools that we've seen in Jackson and in Mississippi in a long time, but it was one of the most timely tools we could ever run across when you're talking about a community who had to stand up and fight against a state takeover, right? And you could invest all your energy in the win or lose of do we keep our schools in local control? Where keeping them in local control is a small part of the victory. Offering a solution for how they can thrive and live and under a shared vision between community, school, administration, that was the difference. And it's continuing to be the difference because once you mobilize people around one issue and they see any inch towards victory, then people say, well, what's next?
What else?
You always got to be prepared for the what else and the what's next. And this one of the times that we were able to say, it's not just about telling the state that they can't take our schools. It's also about showing them that we know how to take care of them ourselves.
Whew, you know, Albert, I think I'm going to take a snippet out of this podcast so I can play that back for myself over and over again. Everyone, for our listening audience, Albert has been talking about the development of community schools in Jackson, Mississippi. This is a body of work in which the NEA Foundation, which hosts this podcast, is very deeply invested. It rests on the premise that schools and community have to be of one voice, one vision. And the practice of school community partnership is at the core, which is what Albert is talking about. You know, Albert, I'm so appreciative to hear you talk about the power of that strategy in Jackson. And I'm so appreciative also of your leadership alongside that of so many others throughout Jackson and the superintendent, Dr. Green, who is also so committed to seeing this come to that community. It's not easy work, but it is, from what you have just described, obviously we want to talk about it. Yeah, because one of the things that I want to do through this podcast, Albert, is introduce people to those strategies that have been proven to bring justice to children and communities in schools. And this community school strategy is one of our chief priorities. So, yeah, I'd love if you talk more about it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful struggle. It's this thing where it's a shared idea, but it's all these levels of accountability. Mm-hmm. We got to meet this thing around test scores when it comes to state accountability. Teachers got to do different things to be responsible to the district, But in this process, you see all of these necessary fits and starts where everybody wants to get to the same place, but then we sputter at different times necessarily, because one thing about strategy is that things can look good on paper when we map them out. And then the day-to-day of practicing, but then also listening back from the community as we practice with them. You have to be honest about something that you thought you could do in 6 months might take you 3 years. But it's a necessary 3 years, because what you get on the other end is a clean product. We started off with a superintendent who walked in with a mission that was strictly, I got to turn this district around and I got to keep it out of the threat of state control. Right. And so a lot of that was rooted in test scores. He didn't want to deal with something like community schools because it was like, oh, that's just another thing to manage. And now he one of the champions. This can do that. Like these things, a lot of these things that I want, and the way that I want to involve students, parents, and community in changing this district, this is one of the mechanisms. And so it's been a beautiful process of chaos.
Yeah.
Chaos and production, and chaos and production. And chaos and production. And it feels great to say, like, on the other end of it, the last product is the one we're going to be the most proud of, because it's the one we went through the fire together for, where everybody had to kind of test their own metal, test each other metal, where we had to say, okay, I might not like what this organization did, but I'm more committed to these young people and to these students and to this district than I am to my ego. I'm more committed to the good outcome of what could happen for education in Jackson than I am to my feelings about other individuals. So it's been this place of trial and error, but it's also been a place of honesty and healing, where people can see, okay, sometimes we have to disagree on our way to getting it right.
Yeah.
It don't have to end our relationship. If we started off with the children in the center, then we'll finish with the children in the center, and we'll be more proud of the product that we went through the fire together to get than the one we could have just had dropped in our lap, because we got relationships and we have this way of working that's not so honest. It's just going along to get along. But here it's kind of like, I didn't agree with this and I didn't agree with that. And people have honest conversations about it, whether it's a parent, whether it's a teacher, whether it's an administrator, whether it's somebody from the district level. And people go through these cycles of chaos and productivity. But I know after all the chaos, we're going to have a beautiful product that everybody can say, that was worth everything we went through to provide what we provided for our young people, and to set the stage for what many other young people over generations to come will get in this city and in this school district.
I so appreciate that. You know, what I like to say is it's authentic change. A lot of what goes on all over the country is a lot of fake change, layered on change that really, it doesn't go deep enough. because that struggle to make it real has not really happened. And community engagement and changing and improving a school system is not a normal thing, unfortunately, for most of the country.
Right.
Those of us who love the community school strategy are advocating that it be implemented across the country, and every school should be a community school. Every school should have robust, authentic community engagement, but not all are willing to go through that struggle to get to the authentic accountability one to the other, where it becomes lasting and sustainable. So I really so appreciate your illuminating that for our listening audience. I'm wondering, Albert, you've been now, it's kind of a long and winding road, starting with your introduction to Rosa Parks and Evers, you're such a early age, and then becoming a youth organizer and now leader of an organization in Mississippi and one of the leaders of the community schools activity there throughout the state. Can you talk a little bit about what are your takeaways in terms of what you're learning as an activist? Where have you also gone through change in this process?
One of the most immediate things is the gift that was given to me in 2023 when I was allowed to be a guest with the NEA Fellows and going to South Africa. Because I remember a moment being at one of the schools, and these young people had so much joy that I was ashamed of myself, that I felt like I had never felt like that before. Like, I come from conditions that were similar to what I was seeing, but I didn't come through those conditions encouraged to be joyful. And I remember that they had so much energy that at one point, the room was just swallowed up by their presence. And the only thing that I could say was, look at all of that Black joy.
Yeah.
And I heard some sobbing. And I looked over, and you were over there crying. And I don't know how God knew to have me bring Kleenex with me that day. But to see that, and I watched the video every day of those kids singing, and just like the look on their face, their eyes so big. And then for us to be amongst all that joy and hope. And then it's kind of this other narrative that you're not safe wherever you go. And for us, it was just like, yo, we in a place where people just enjoying being people regardless of the conditions they in. I remember walking through one of the communities we were in. And I remember saying it to the group on the bus. It's a difference between what you see and then what you see. So you could walk around and you could see all these desolate conditions. You could see poverty. I saw somewhere that we were welcome to be in. And I was grateful that people allowed us to come and be in the places that they live and in the places that they trying to cause change. But I remember one guy on a bike was riding through playing a gospel song, and he was just singing about Jesus and pumping his fist with a big old smile on his face. And everybody who saw him ride through at least responded to him with a fist pump. All the community people. And he just singing. And all I could remember was the thing that I talk about all the time is that we try to assign people to their conditions. So your place in the world is what your condition is. So if you come from bad conditions, this world trains you to see that person as a bad person. And so what I've been trying to say about South Africa and Mississippi and Chicago and other places is that you're looking at great people that's living in terrible conditions that's not of their own making. And so if that's just the most recent and the most impactful one for me, because in my life, I can't recall a time that I ever looked at my conditions and I was still able to say, but I got joy. Those kids had joy. They were eating lunch and singing. The whole day, they just so proud that we there to see them. And so I felt so good that that can exist in somebody, because it made me have to search for it inside of myself. It's like, well, where do you go find the joy that says, regardless of what I woke up to today, I got another chance, and I should make the most of how I make myself feel and how I make the world feel about me. And I learned that from those kids. And I watched the video every day of them singing in the background while I'm holding my camera. And then Senator Jackson in the background taking selfies with them. And it's this thing of like really appreciating just life and being alive. And they taught me that, and I felt so ashamed and so selfish for the days that I came there with a lot on me, but I could only imagine I wasn't the only person that would a lot on me. And so those kids made me be honest with myself about what it is to dust off and go again.
You know, I just want to thank you for bringing me back to that moment. I remember very well that moment, and I was indeed sobbing at what I was experiencing, to be surrounded by hundreds of children who were so full of joy, but also the love that pervaded that atmosphere, and that school was so extraordinary. And I remember sobbing for all the children who don't experience that in their school, that, you know, that incredible love of those educators toward the children, the children's response to them. I remember them reciting the Constitution, you know, little kindergartners with no prompting at length, 10 minutes recitation, no prompting. Just, you know, it's just the most amazing, amazing thing. And I also remember, Albert, on one of those stops, you said you wanted your sons to experience that, and that you wanted to bring your sons to South Africa, that they might see and experience what you did there. And leaving aside whether or not it's about South Africa or here, how are you taking who you are, where you've been, what you've observed, what you've experienced? What are you imparting into your sons that they might hopefully continue in their own way, in their own time, the work?
Mm-hmm. As much as I can, I try to get them to understand the power of the common man in an uncommon world. I said that was the greatest lesson I learned from watching Hollis Watkins. Was you had several people who had movies made about them, people who have written books, who had books written about them. But Hollis was a man of the people every day. And so I try to teach my children that, you know, even when they go to school and they come home with a great report card, I'm not concerned about the A on the piece of paper more so than I'm concerned about the A that you get in the character that you are as a person. So I'm not just trying to produce A students. I'm trying to produce A character people, where when you go out in the world, you committed to doing the best that you can do by where you are every day. And it's not easy. When you 18 and you got a bunch of other influences, or you 16 and you got a bunch of other influences that's a lot younger and a lot cooler than your dad, it's not the easiest thing to impart on my kids. But because I've had them around this all their life, it's something that they familiar with enough that I can have these conversations with them. And I still have to let them bump their heads with life and culture and whatever. But it's always something for them to learn about why it's so important to continue to come back. Even when you make mistakes, how do you take the things that you bumped your head on and prevent another head bump for somebody else that wouldn't know better if it wasn't for you? Like, I'm quite sure my children would have made a lot more mistakes in life if it wasn't for me letting them see me make mistakes and be vulnerable in front of them and tell them about some of the mistakes I made. But yeah, all of what I've learned from so many people in my life, I've tried to have my children around it to touch it and see it and feel it. But then I've also tried to make them understand what it means in the day-to-day world and how you show up. And the fact that you don't value a person because of what they have, you value them because they are. You value them because they're a person. You respect them because they're a person. And the world feeds you back what you feed to it. And so I always want my kids to understand that. Like, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So I hope that you're making as many good actions as you can so the world feeds you back great things.
That's so beautiful. You know, Albert, I could talk to you for hours, but podcast is not supposed to last for hours. So
well, you know how we get in. I can always come back.
Oh, hey. Okay, write that down. We will be having you back, Albert. Thank you for that. But I'd like to leave this podcast, as I do so many, with a couple of common questions I ask just about everybody. So I'd like to ask you, what gives you hope in this moment in your work, or just in general?
It's people like Stuart Lucas. I talked to him last week. He checked in, and
Stuart Lucas, everyone, is one of the foundation's
one of your board members. Yeah. And so I met him through you, and we built this genuine relationship. But he called to check in about politics in the future and what do we see for the right now, and just being able to have people who want to have those conversations, regardless of what our financial status is, our racial status is. It's like, hey, let's sit down and have the conversations that help us figure out what tomorrow should look like, what tomorrow can look like, and what we can do to influence that. So that's a place of hope, is that those conversations exist. And I know it's not just between me and him. It's several people around this country right now figuring out what tomorrow looks like.
Oh, yes, as we must. And thank you so much for the shout out to the board of the NEA Foundation. Stuart Lucas, listening audience, is one of our board members. And like so many others, as Albert has just referenced, deeply, deeply involved in the work, such that outreach and engagement in between board meetings is a normal thing for us. These are individuals who are passionate about the furtherance of public education and justice executed through public education in this country, and we are grateful for each and every one of them. I think, Albert, also, one of the last questions I might ask you, we always try to encourage those who are listening to not just listen, but to take what they have heard and figure out what it might mean for them and how they might act upon some moment of inspiration that came from this podcast. At the same time, we try to give a little support. So as you think about how to encourage others in this moment, this daunting moment in this country, and assuredly in the Deep South, what counsel might you give to those who standing on the edges right now but could do more?
Yeah, follow the deepest truth of your heart. I think a lot of people know what's right, and that we live in a culture where sometimes the consequences of doing right is being ostracized. And it's some things we got to be willing to be ostracized for. And that should definitely include the greater good of our fellow man. Yeah. So I say follow the deepest truth of your heart, regardless of what it costs, because the reward is not in keeping friends, it's having genuine people that's impacted by the example you set. They may encourage somebody else to do and live and think and be different on a day-to-day basis. So the deepest truth of your heart is our path to the way having a better world. I know this quote that says, ambition is the pathway to truth, and persistence is the vehicle by which we arrive. So have ambition and be persistent. Follow the deepest truth of your heart with ambition and persistence, and we'll arrive at the place where everybody is valued, respected, and lifted up in the ways that they should be.
I love that take on ambition. It reminds me, some people might think of ambition as something you would want to shun, or you don't want to admit you want ambition. And it's kind of like someone said to me once something about, you just want power, right? Making a negative of the desire for power. And I thought, my thought was, don't you? Should we not all want power? It's not a matter of having it or not having it. It's what you want to do with it. And if your heart is in the right place, as you have said, ambition and power are necessary things if we are going to actually see change in this country, and certainly in public education. Albert, as we close, is there anything that you wanted to add or say, other than I'm just sending you a barrage of questions here, but is there anything you would like to just say extemporaneously?
I just want to thank you for letting me be here. I definitely want to honor the spirit of Bob Moses, Medgar Evers, Fannie Lou Hamer, June Johnson, Hollis Watkins, so many people who, Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte, that came before and really left the space for young people like me to find my way down that freedom road. And I just could never do enough, and I could never say enough, but I know that I found my life's work by being influenced by the ways that those people stepped up and lived in front of me and before me, and the things that they left me to do in my lifetime.
And anyone and everyone who knows anything about what's going on in Mississippi right now knows, Albert Sykes, that your name has long since been added to that list. I am so, so, so grateful for this time that we've had with you. It's just been a privilege to spend a few moments. I have recorded your commitment to return to this podcast at some time in the future. And I just want to thank our entire listening audience for tuning in today to Up Close. And if you like what you've heard here today, I want to invite you to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcast. You'll be hearing from us again real soon. Thanks, everyone.